Okay, so tonight we're talking mostly type 3. Obviously, questions about anything are very welcome, but this is mostly about management of the non-ambulant type 3. Now, if you are not from the UK or particularly from England, you won't understand the implication of this. And this is because, particularly with nusinersen, when it came out, you could have nusinersen if you were an ambulant type 3, or if you lost ambulation within a year of November 2019, which is when nusinersen was approved. But if you stopped walking before that, even a month before that, you did not get nusinersen. So now all type 3s can have nusinersen, whether they lost ambulation or are still walking. Risdiplam, there are still issues about getting risdiplam, and obviously Zolgensma is not appropriate for type 3. So this is mostly about those on risdiplam who are type 3 or borderline type 3, because there are some type 2s who are very good, who are not a lot different from the type 3 who didn't walk very much. But this is about the non-ambulant type 3 particularly. So the range of ability in type 3. Now, type 3 is defined by ability to walk, but type 3 is also split into type 3A and type 3B. And type 3A had an onset of symptoms under 5 years old. That's assuming you recognize the symptoms. And type 3B after 5 years old. And my honest feeling is this is very arbitrary, because if you were 4 years and 11 months and you saw signs, you would be 3A. And if you were 5 years and 1 day, you would be a 3B. So somewhere, I think the idea is that the weaker type 3s are 3A, and the likelihood is they will not maintain ambulation, whereas the 3Bs who are stronger and therefore become obvious later are more likely to walk into adulthood, but that's not guaranteed. And not only is it not guaranteed, the problems of type 3 and non-ambulant type 3 can appear in all children. Now, these two young ladies, both type 3, one stopped walking and had scoliosis surgery, and one continued walking and has just had scoliosis surgery. So the fact that you stay walking as type 3 does not necessarily prevent scoliosis. Now, obviously, spinal surgery can get in the way of nusinersen, and so hopefully those who've had spinal surgery will be eligible for risdiplam, but I'm not sure how it works yet. So it's much more appropriate to classify by function. The weakest children will only really achieve a few steps. We have children, the functional distance is 10 meters, and that's what we call functional distance, whether you can walk 10 meters. But the definition that NICE used was 5 steps, and that was taken from the Hammersmith Motor Function Scale. And the reason we made it 5 steps, although originally it was 4, was because you can go plonk, plonk and fall, and that's not strictly walking, that's falling with style. And so originally the definition between type 2 and type 3 was set at 5 steps, because to do 5 steps, you had to have some control, whereas to do 2 steps, if you ever see a normal child walking, it's 1, 2, plonk. And they end up sitting on their bum for the first few times, it's 1, 2, plonk. And so functional distance is considered 10 meters, whereas definition of type 3 is 5 steps. And I know there's been a lot of argument about who is and who isn't a type 3, how many steps somebody took, how many steps somebody didn't take, but that has now become irrelevant, certainly in the UK and certainly in England, where nusinersen is available for all and has been in Scotland from the beginning. So the weakest children will only take a few steps. We have children who take 20, 30 steps, are classified as type 3, but ultimately they lose ambulation under the age of 2 or 3 years old, hardly walk, and are really the same as a strong type 2. Interestingly, a lot of type 3s have stronger arms than type 2, particularly because a lot of type 3s crawl, which type 2s rarely do. I know there are type 2s who crawl, but they never seem to do it for long, or certainly didn't pre-treatment. We have a type 2 who lost the ability to crawl, is now on nusinersen and is crawling everywhere. Unfortunately, it means she doesn't like to stand and walk, but she is at least crawling everywhere, which she had lost the ability to do. So they are strong type 2s. It doesn't prevent scoliosis, and studies coming out show that this group of type 3s can have some of the same respiratory problems as type 2s. It was always said that type 3s do not get respiratory problems, and while they rarely end up on BiPAP, some of the weaker type 3s can end up on BiPAP if they have a horrible scoliosis quite early and lose ambulation quite early. It's very rare, but it's not impossible. So the intermediate group will walk for longer, but always struggle with distances, notably fatigue when they're doing a 6-minute walk test. It gets slower and slower, have a lot of difficulty with stairs and getting up from the floor, and uneven ground. They don't particularly like walking outdoors, hills, beaches. A lot of them don't like walking on the beach, and they will lose ambulation before or around puberty. And certainly for boys, when they have that rapid growth spurt, but it's not only height, it's width. They get very broad shoulders, narrow hips, tall. Yeah, okay, spotty, but that goes. But the height and other things don't. And the taller the child, the more likely they will struggle with ambulation. To be honest, smaller children tend to find it easier, which is why more type 3 women walk for longer than type 3 boys and men. And that's purely because of the height and weight, not because they are necessarily weaker. And the strongest type 3s will walk into adulthood. Now, a lot of type 3s are very, very mild. And I have met type 3s and I thought, how on earth did you get diagnosed? You are so mild, doing stairs, doing the works. But most ambulant type 3s will struggle with longer distances, with stairs, getting off the floor, and fatigue and stamina. And slowly, over time in their 30s and 40s, they will deteriorate. And a lot of type 3s will use a wheelchair, at least outdoors. Okay, so are new treatments making more type 3s? So the accepted is that type 1 children, a lot of these treatments will make them sit and give them the function of a type 2. And the good walkers, the good type 2s, at the top end of the scale, the crawlers, the children that can lift their head, the children who can quite easily get themselves from lying to sitting, may well end up being independent walkers. But that is assuming they do it young, while they've still got a relatively small body to move around and don't have scoliosis. Because obviously we know that all children with SMA type 1, type 2 will get a degree of scoliosis. And these type 3s are also getting scoliosis. It doesn't mean that they will have surgery if they're stronger, if the spine can stay straight for long enough or not too curved or not deteriorate quickly. But certainly scoliosis is still a problem in a lot of these new type 3s. But physiotherapy and the treatments are not based on the classification 3A, 3B, good walker, bad walker. They're based on what we see, based on what you can do, because there are many, many variables. How old you were when you lost ambulation, how long you walked for, how strong you were, what your contractures are. There are so many things we have to take into account. If you've been non-ambulant for 2 years, you're going to look very, very different from somebody who's been non-ambulant for 20 years. And the aims of physiotherapy don't change with the new treatments. We still need to think about useful function. It's no good me giving you a set of exercises that will help you do something that will have absolutely no impact on your life. So I can stretch your ankles or I can stretch your knees, but if you're still going to spend most of your time in a wheelchair and I ignore your shoulders, I haven't really done very much useful. So older children, teenagers, adults, you have to set your functional goals. You have to say realistically, what useful function do I want to gain next? Because if you take it in small steps, you're more likely to achieve it. You're less likely to get frustrated, and altogether you will feel more positive about the drugs you're on. If you set unrealistic goals, or if your physio promises you things you're not ever going to achieve, or you work on contractures that have been there for 20 years, you are not going to get very far. But if the contractures are not there, we need to prevent them or reduce them. We need, with the children, the type 3s, to always think contractures. We need to think serial casting. I have a young man of 14 who we serially cast at 9 and is still doing incredibly well. And it did impact very positively on his walking. So we need to think, if you've got an ambulant 3, you need to do all this: maintain power, try and improve or reduce contractures, keep as mobile as possible. Now, how do you maintain mobility? Pushing a wheelchair is maintaining mobility. Being active is maintaining mobility. Trying some of your own transfers, rolling around in the bed. Mobility is not walking. Mobility is moving. Moving from A to B, even if it's up and down a bed, backwards and forwards in the wheelchair. Assisting with transfers. I have quite a lot of the type 2s now, the better type 2s, who we are trying to get doing a bit more of their own transferring, working on shoulders, working on arms, trying to get them out of their wheelchairs, onto plinths, onto beds. And if you don't try it, you'll never know if you can do it. We need to reduce postural asymmetry. And the biggest problem that we have, particularly with teenagers, is they don't realize they're asymmetrical. Asymmetry has developed over time, and I've had 2 young ladies recently who, when I took pictures of their back, and I'll show you one of them, did not know how bad their backs were. One didn't even realize she wasn't straight, and this one certainly had no concept of how bad her spine had got, because it changes slowly over time and you adapt. If you're constantly sitting to one side, your head position changes, so you're always upright. Your view of the world still looks the same. You don't take your head with you and think, oh my goodness, everything looks skew-with. You maintain your head in this upright position, and that's a normal reaction. We do that if we're moving, and your head always wants to find that up and down position so that you have a straight view of the world. If you're leaning to the side, your head will still do it. And if you get and pull somebody to the side, you will see that their head goes the opposite way to try and maintain midline. So reducing postural asymmetry needs mirrors in a lot of cases. And if you don't have mirrors, get somebody to take a picture of your back when you're in free sitting, not in your wheelchair, to have a look. And we need to prevent pain, because obviously some of the kids do have yucky hips. Contractures can be painful. We need to make sure that pain is not an issue. Okay, so we do need to assess if you are going for a treatment. I know that I have had people who've said they're not getting, adults who've said they're not seeing a physio. Not acceptable under standards of care, and they're international. They're nothing to do with the UK. But in the UK, the neuromuscular centres are monitored, so there should always be a physio attached to any service that calls itself neuromuscular. So basically, you should be getting an assessment from someone, and somebody should be looking at your power Now, I know a lot of centres don't bother with power, and I know people say, oh, it's only GOS that bother with power, it's not important, but it is important. Power is very important, because if you don't know where somebody is weak, you can't work on those muscle groups, you can't really understand why things are difficult, what's going wrong. So power is really important, and we measure it. Now, I accept that in a weak type 2 or a type 1, we don't measure power extensively. We accept that a child who's doing very little has probably got a lot of what we call sub-gravity power, cannot lift their arms against gravity, cannot lift their legs against gravity, although a lot of children are doing amazing things on new treatments, and I'm sure some adults are finding movements and muscles they hadn't found for a long, long time. But power is important, and the stronger you get, the more important it is, because muscle imbalance will come with some of these drugs. In other words, some muscle groups will get much stronger at the expense of others, and in children and teenagers particularly, that will lead to increasing contractures. Now, we want to measure joint range, and that's important, because if you don't know how far your muscles can move, if you can only move your arm this much yourself, you need to know how much I can move it, because there's no point in me saying, oh, well, we need to work the muscles that'll straighten your arm. If it's so contracted, there's no straighten to go. There's nowhere to make it straight. So joint range is important. But when we are measuring joint range, we're also feeling muscles, because you can feel if there is any give. You can feel if serial casting will work. You can feel if stretching will work. And on the whole, with children in SMA, the muscles are not fibrotic. They're not unstretchy like some neuromuscular conditions. The muscles still stretch. Things are tight, but they can stretch. Once you are an adult and your bones stop growing and your joints sort of stiffen up, it's much, much harder to do anything about contractures without surgery. It's not impossible, but it's certainly some contractures you will never get away from. If you're sitting all day, you're going to have hip flexion contractures unless you are extremely rare. The turning your hands palm up, and we've talked about this one before. Once you lose that, it is one of the most complex movements in the body. It involves wrist and elbows. It involves the radius rolling over the ulna, the two forearm bones. It is far too complex a movement. Once it is stiff, it will stay stiff. And I was talking to our shoulder surgeon who does all upper limb surgery, and he said there is no way you are going to get that back even with surgery. It's just too complex. We need to look at function, and function is usually defined by functional scales. The biggest problem we have with functional scales, you can talk about the Hammersmith motor, you can talk about the new chopper 10, you can talk about whatever you want, but actually, if all you want to be able to do is roll over in bed, then those scales are not going to tell you whether you can do it, because even if you can roll on a plinth in the physio department or wherever it is you're going, that is not the same as rolling on a squishy bed or rolling in your own bed. It's very, very different. So not all the things that are important to you. You may be a photographer and you want to be able to press the button better or position the camera better or just be able to hold it better. You may have other sports, hobbies or interests that are not captured on bog standard functional scales. So think about it as a teenager, as an adult, as a teenager, what job do you want to end up doing? You know, we know that SMA are generally extremely intelligent. We know in the UK you cannot train to be a doctor, but there are plenty of other countries where you can. Architects, we have lots and lots of lawyers around. I'm not sure how that's going to work out. Tons of artists, lots and lots of artists, very arty group of people as well. So you know, what is important to you, not what's important to the physio. And yes, if you're having assessments for Risdiplam, for NICE, for your drug administration, for your whatever body is governing, giving you those drugs, that is one set of assessments. That is not what I do. Those are research assessments. They are data that have to go onto a database for funding, for all sorts of things. But ultimately, the functional scales that are important to you are the ones you devise for yourself, or even sometimes for your kids. If your child says they really want to be able to do this, bring that to clinic and let's work on it. Spine and posture we need to assess constantly, constantly, constantly in the growing child and young adult. We need to assess mobility. And as I said, mobility is not just about walking. It's any method of getting from A to B, be it a long distance, a short distance, or literally just rolling over or wiggling your bum up the bed. And pain. And we do need to know about pain, because pain, when it gets too ridiculous, as we know, as Marnie will tell us, pain really gets in the way of so many things. Okay, so what are the priorities? We need to identify functional goals, and this is dependent, as we said, on what age you are, how long you have been non-ambulant, and what you can achieve must be based on contractures, your spine situation. Have you had spinal surgery? Have you not had spinal surgery? Are you going to have it? Have you had it but needed extending? On disuse atrophy, which we will talk to when we get to weakness, although we've talked about it before, on your weight. And that's not saying that if you are fat, but obviously if you are ultra skinny as well, stamina and weight are related. What was your maximum function in the first place? If you never ever got upstairs and stopped walking 20 years ago, are you seriously thinking that you're suddenly going to get upstairs now? The answer is probably not. Okay, so type 3 gets scoliosis if they lose ambulation before puberty. Simple as that. Some ambulant teenagers do as well, and where possible, we will always try and keep an ambulant type 3 ambulant post-spinal surgery, because that is what the vast majority of them want. If they walked into spinal surgery, they want to walk again afterwards. And on the whole, most spinal surgeons will let you get up and stand after spinal surgery, as long as you don't start doing fandangos and the birdie dance and all sorts of weird and wonderful things. So as long as you do things that don't twist and don't bend, then they will let you get up and walk relatively quickly. But we need to assess spines from top to bottom, because if you're having spinal surgery, we want to know where your head is. And we know that there are people who lose their head with spinal surgery or find that it's in a different place, because if you were always sitting there and your head was used to going with you and you're suddenly straight, your head may not be where you're expecting it to be. It depends on the strength of your head and again, what level of type 3 you were. Kyphosis, lordosis, we need to look at your pelvis. If you are not having surgery that goes all the way into your pelvis, then we need to be careful, because you will get a lot of wear and tear in the gap that they leave, because that's where you'll do all your bending, that's where you'll do all your movement, and we have to protect that part of the spine. It's really important that we protect that part of the spine. And when I say we as physios, but you as teenagers must protect that part of your spine, because if you overuse it, as we know, several years ago, we had a young lady who was a swimmer, and she probably did a bit too much and got a lot of pain at that level, to the point where she had to have the surgery extended. So we need to be careful and look after that part. And that means exercising your back muscles and, as far as possible, some tummy muscles. We had one young lady who had spinal surgery quite a long time ago and said one of the best things for her tummy muscles was singing lessons. And not only did it improve her tummy muscles, but also improved her respiratory reserve as well. So we need to look at how mobile you are, how much movement you have around the pelvis, how much movement you have at the hips, because if your hips are quite stiff and you've only got that tiny little bit of spine doing everything, again, we need to look after that. And this is all about thinking ahead. It's easy just to forget how important these things are at the time. When you've had spinal surgery with a gap to allow you to continue walking or maintain mobility, even if you are not walking, look after that gap. Okay, so scoliosis in type 3, and this is the young lady who had no concept of how bad her back had got. And this is really difficult because it gets there slowly, slowly over time. You never see that view of yourself. And this is what we must keep an eye on so much in our type 3s. Can new treatments prevent this? We don't know yet. We seriously don't know. We haven't been treating enough 3s for long enough to know if they can prevent this. Now, I'm not talking about the children who were on Zolgensma and who are walking. They are not the children we are talking about. We are talking about diagnosed type 3s who have at some point struggled with either walking, stairs, getting up off the floor. We are not talking about Zolgensma children who are walking. However, I have to tell you, I have 2 Zolgensma children who are walking and both have mild scoliosis. Now, they're only tiny. The likelihood is they will both end up with scoliosis. So do not ever think that just because you were treated early and you are walking, you are immune. So let's think about what the priorities of management. Now, the priorities of management are your priorities of management, or your parents or your child. It's not ours. This is not what physio is about. Physio is not about dictating what is important to you. But what we have to be is realistic. Is trying to regain walking realistic? How long is it since you've walked? How contracted are you? What about your scoliosis? Is it realistic? Is it not only a realistic goal, is it a functionally useful goal? If you've been a full-term wheelchair user for a long time, is walking a little bit going to be functional? It might, if it means that you can get from A to B more easily than you can in your wheelchair. If you can access somebody's home that you can't access now, if you can access those places that aren't changing places in toilets, maybe you think it is a realistic goal. Fine, but you have to work that out very, very carefully with your physio, how you start and how you're going to get there. And don't plan to get there. Aim to get there, but always think you might not. Is trying to regain standing realistic, and is it functional? Now, the young lady who ended up having her back surgery extended first came to us at Hammersmith as it happened. She was an artist and she wanted to paint murals. She wasn't Banksy, that's no secret, but she wanted to be able to stand to paint murals, and therefore standing was a realistic goal for her. I have had a young man who wanted to be a sound mixer. He is a sound mixer. He had to stand to reach all the controls. He had elbow contractures. He needed to stand. So there are things that you may need in life where standing is a realistic goal, a useful goal, something that you actually want. So think about what you're trying to achieve. You have to make it into bite-sized chunks. You need your physio to talk you through how you would get to these places. And one of the big ways of regaining standing, as we know with the adults, is standing slings. And a lot of adults are going that way. You know that how we assess gait. And the main way of assessing gait in type 3 is the 6-minute walk test. But it's certainly not the only way. There's timed up and go. There's 10 meters, there's 2-meter walk tests, you name it, they'll find a test for it. But again, you do not have to think that walking means that you have to be able to do a 6-minute walk test. What it means is that you have to be able to walk the functional distance that's useful for you. And if you are a type 3 who is walking and struggling, then you have to think, is walking still useful? So we need, in terms of therapy, to set some priorities. Now, power, joint range, all these things, safe transferring, full integration, pain-free function. These are the things that we as physios need to work with you on to get to the goals that you want. So most importantly, we know is managing the weakness, but it's not just about weakness, it's about stamina and about fatigue. Not everything is about power. You do not use power that much during the day. You use stamina. You don't work your muscles maximally. That is as hard as possible. And in fact, it's very rare for a normal person to work maximally unless they're doing a sport or they're in a profession or a job where you really do need power. If you're somebody who has to do a lot of lifting, a lot of whatever during your job, then maybe you need a lot of power. But in a day-to-day job, as a lawyer, as a doctor even, so many jobs that you can think of, you do not need maximum power. Very often what we're looking for is mobility in movement, being able to lift, being able to move, to be able to reach, to be able to sustain movement, and to be able to continue that. You know, we have this problem with some of the small children with electric wheelchairs that it's push, push, push. And that is about sustaining and actually keeping a movement going. It's a bit like being able to sing a long note. It's being able to continue sustainability, and it's also about the fatigue ability to keep going at the same level. You may be able to sustain it, but then the power may drop off and get weaker and weaker. And we know that's the same with writing. Sometimes it's the same with typing. Sometimes it's the same just keeping your head up. Exercise. We've seen all this before, but there's never, ever, ever, from my point of view, a problem with repeating it. So we know the good is symmetrical. What you're doing on one side, you're doing on the other. And we know that SMA is extremely asymmetrical. We know that you will not be able to strengthen one side as much as the other. So actually you should be working your weaker side a little bit more, not lots more. Symmetry is still the best. Targeting the right groups, I have said over and over and over again, it is so important with upper limbs. We need the exercise to be achievable, but we need it to be effective and fun if you want it to be fun. Boring is a killer. But I was talking to a young man last week who was working with a sling. Swing, 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 swing. Doing absolutely nothing because there was no effort involved. There wasn't even stamina. I don't even think we got to the point of fatigue. Swing, swing, swing. It was all momentum and bounce from the springy, slingy, whatever he was using. So what we did was we stopped him, swing, 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 swing. And I said, when you get to as far as you can go with one way in movement, hold it and count to 5, and then straighten it and hold it and count to 5 and build it up to 10. Don't just swing, 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 getting you absolutely nowhere. So you need to be effective. And the only way you can be effective is with good advice. Now, it doesn't have to be a physio. There are personal trainers out there. There are exercise therapists out there. And I know a lot of people have said they don't have a physio. People know where I am. Unfortunately, I have millions and millions of exercise programs, but everybody needs their own. It is no good looking on the internet. We know Joe Wicks hardly worked for anybody in the SMA community, but there is a lot of exercise online. There are Pilates videos done for neuromuscular. Now, a lot of them are for ambulant neuromuscular. They weren't done for SMA particularly, but there's a lot on YouTube that involves in a wheelchair or sitting. So there is plenty of exercise out there. Ideally, it is somebody with experience. You may prefer yoga to something like Pilates. Personally, I don't, but I like Pilates. But there is no excuse for not finding effective, because if you can't find yourself at least somebody, a physio from somewhere who can give you advice and set you in the right direction, point you where you should be pointed. But there is plenty of stuff out there, loads of exercise. So the bad exercise are too hard or too easy, like this swing, swing, swim, doing absolutely nothing. And I think even he agreed that it wasn't exactly causing him to have an aerobic reaction. We have talked aerobic reactions. It sounds like some nasty rash, but it isn't. When you are working aerobically, you get a small increase in heart rate, a small increase in the depth of your respiration, so you're breathing bigger, and you get a small increase in temperature. Now, you may get hot and sweaty, and I will never forget a young lady who hadn't done exercise for ages and ages, doing some exercise with a standing sling, and her reaction was, I haven't sweated like that since I can't remember when. So she actually got sweaty from doing it. And that is what you would expect. It doesn't have to be dripping, but noticeably warmer by doing the exercise. Now, be careful with swimming. There is a big issue with swimming and fatigue, because what you forget is that firstly, you can't see the sweat in the water, and secondly, you don't realize how much you fatigue in the swimming pool. So please beware, you should not be in a pool, certainly initially, for more than 30 minutes. You can build up to 45 or an hour, but you will really suffer with fatigue if you work too hard in a pool, particularly now with coming out of lockdown, if you haven't been doing it for a while. Don't go in there and go mad, because if you overdo it, then you've virtually wrecked yourself for several days. Take it easy when you start. So apart from too hard or too easy, and too hard is just very, very frustrating. You won't get anywhere if you've set yourself too high goals, if you're using too high weights, if the TheraBand you're using you can't stretch. We've talked a lot about colors and how you can change the color. This one is fairly tough, but this yellow is fairly stretchy. And I am devastated to learn that my very favorite cream is no longer available in the UK at all. TheraBand are not, I'm not sure if they're not making it or just not importing it, but we'll have to find one. We'll maybe have to go to the yellow. It does give that little bit more resistance. This is Megilo's yellow, which gives more resistance. But don't think that you have to go for the biggest colors, the toughest ones first, because if you double them up, you double the resistance. And if you have a nice long piece and you really want to make it hard, well, you can just fold it in 3 or fold it in 4, and you've really, really increased the resistance. So start low and double it, and then you don't have to buy lots and lots of colors, or starting too high and getting frustrated by it. Remember what your legs can do, maybe your arms can't do, what your right arm can do, your left arm can't do. So having a lower level color is more effective, because all you need to do is fold it or unfold it to be effective. Boring, boring, boring. You won't want to do it. Why would you do something that's repetitive and boring? Now, I'm going to get shot by a lot of you out there by saying that some of these bicycles and hand bicycles and things are ultimately incredibly boring, unless you're sitting in front of Netflix, which is a great idea, a good way to do it. But don't forget to change the resistance every so often, and also to check how long you're doing it for. One episode of The Crown or whatever's in at the moment, I have no idea. I'm not a big Netflix watcher. I'm not a big anything watcher. Too busy. Don't ask me what I'm doing. I have no idea. I never seem to get around to watching much television. But don't forget to monitor yourself when you're doing these things. You need to increase your fatigue. You need to increase, so not your fatigue, you need to increase your stamina, increase your times, increase your resistance. Targeting the wrong groups is the biggest problem we have. And we have said this over and over again. If you're doing all hip flexors, like standing in slings and dangling, if you are doing standing slings, you must have your feet on the floor. Please do not dangle. You are completely using the wrong muscle groups. And we've had to take several children out of slings for walking because they were just getting tighter and tighter hips. So don't dangle. If you are using standing slings, you must be taking weight through your feet to get the right muscle groups working. We know this with the arms. We've talked endlessly about this is biceps, this is brachioradialis. They do two different jobs. And those of you who say you can't get your hands to your mouth, it's because you are not using biceps. Biceps does that, hand to mouth. Brachioradialis does that, hand to boob level. That is mouth, that is biceps, that is brachioradialis, that is boob level. And you cannot, unless you come down, use brachioradialis for eating, because the problem is you may go there, but you don't come up high enough. So you either then, all those people who do that are using brachioradialis instead of biceps. So if you don't work your biceps, everybody thinks they've got strong biceps because they can bend their elbows. No, this is why knowing what is working is so important. And this is why so many physios get it wrong. Sorry, but they do. Excessive weights, things that are too heavy. This is 1 kilo. You should always start small and increase. Now, when I'm doing Pilates, I have a 2 kilo weight and I can never do it for long. I am always fooling myself that I can manage Pilates with a 2 kilo. I always end up with a 1 kilo. But I'm big and brave and I think I can do it and I can't. So start off small. And we've talked about this. If 1 kilo is too much, make yourself weights. Make different weights. These are just bags of lentils, split peas. Make weights, use wrist weights, fill old socks with weights, which whatever you can do. Sorry, I've just dropped my TheraBand on the floor, which is not helpful, but never mind, that can stay there for now. So if you do excessive weights, you will not do as much. So you will build up possibly a little bit more power, but you are not getting the sustainability and the stamina. And ultimately, as I said, power does not always get you there. We want to work all three together. Holding for longer, doing it for longer, then doing it harder. But the doing it harder, the more power is the least, the last. You need sustainability, manageability, and power last. Don't go for asymmetrical, and please don't go for hazardous, and that includes your trampolines. Vibration therapy on a trampoline, rebound therapy on a trampoline is not the same as trampolining. And a lot of schools use rebound therapy for stability, for balance, for activity, for arms, for weight bearing. And that is not the same as trampolining, because most of rebound therapy is done in lying and sitting. But exercise should not be hazardous. You should not be pulling muscles. You should not be hurting yourself. If you are, it's time to get yourself a personal trainer or speak to a physio. Okay, we like balls and peanuts, not quite as easy for adults, getting onto them, getting off them, unless you really are very mobile. Peanuts are much easier than balls, but just because you can't use a therapy ball does not mean you can't use any ball. Now, there are balls. This is a Pilates ball. It's quite squishy. You can use it to exercise your hands. You can be pushing. You can use it to exercise your legs. You can even put it behind your head and squash it backwards. So these sorts of squishy balls, doesn't have to be a Pilates ball, but these sorts of squishy balls are great for exercise. It doesn't have to be the great big therapy balls. Now, if you're in a wheelchair and you want to do a bit of work, even a small ball tucked on the outside of your legs pushing outwards, you can use a whoopee cushion, you can squeeze whatever you like. But I particularly like these squishy balls. As I say, it doesn't have to be a Pilates ball. Anything that's quite squishy, you can get them in pound shops very often. You can use for therapy. Arms, you can stick it under your arm and squash it that way. You can stick it behind your back and squash it. You can even stick it in your tummy and squash it forwards. There's all sorts of things you can do with a squashy ball. The cycling, the hand cycling, this is one of the low geared trikes, the picture. They are incredibly expensive. They're about £3,000 or £4,000. So don't think that you're going to go out and get a low geared trike. WizKids will fund them for children so that it's not impossible to get hold of them. But there's a lot of electric bikes around at the moment, but you will need to check it out. We like Pilates. We don't expect you to do this sort of exercise unless you've got pretty naff hip flexion contractures, and then you'll get up in that position by yourself. I must admit, I don't find that easy, but she is cheating a little bit by holding on to one knee because it does help. Horse riding is lovely. Now, many of you might think, oh, well, that's impossible if I'm non-ambulant. We do have non-ambulant children and adults riding horses. And if you are particularly into the idea of horses, you can, of course, do what they call carriage driving, which was Prince Philip's favorite. And that's when you take your wheelchair on the back and drive that way. And that is done through Riding for the Disabled. Not all Riding for the Disabled do carriage driving, but a few of them do. But some Riding for the Disabled will take adults. There's no reason why they won't. I certainly know of adults who still go horse riding. Swimming we love. A lot of people getting hot tubs now. I can't tell you what size because I know they are expensive and expensive to heat. But similarly, I won't write letters for you unless it's really going to be a big issue for anybody, because there are pools. I know how difficult it is for adults to access them, but of course, a lot of people are using hospices now, or even private pools, or find a hotel with a club because they may let you go easily off peak. And of course, we love the exercise bands, but anything around the house, be it a squeezy washing up bowl, squeezy washing up bottle, all sorts of things. Several of you will have seen in previous videos or ideas, there is no end of things around the house that you can use to exercise. For children, play is exercise, except iPads, Xboxes, PlayStations, phones. They are not play. That's electronics, and that is not the same. It really is not a way of building up activity. All it's doing is giving you a bit of thumb power and horrible, horrible, horrible posture. Core. What are we doing with the core? Now, one of the biggest problems that we have in SMA is that the abdominal muscles are extremely weak. We know that. That's why a lot of the children have so much in the way of respiratory. And to be perfectly honest, the type 3s do not have a brilliant core either. So we have a lot of problem in exercising core. Now, the first problem with exercising core is if you cannot lift your head up, then you cannot use your core to do a sit-up. But sit-ups and curl-ups and Squashes and whatever are not the be all and end all of working your core. And there are many ways to do it that even just involve, as we say, singing exercises, all sorts of things you can use to work that core. And again, look online, you can use the TheraBand. All you have to do is bring across, not pull your arm. Keep your arm steady and take your whole body across. As simple as that is a core exercise. There is so much that you can do to try and stabilize, and particularly, as I said, those of you who have had spinal surgery where you have a gap, you need to try and get that core strengthened to protect that gap. But it is worth trying a little bit of core in type 3. Certainly in type 2, it is incredibly hard. And as I say, the less head control you've got, the less likely you are to get any core control. But if your head control is good, you should be able to get some core work done. How much, how often? This is always, always, always the question that people hate because they don't like the answer. Not because they don't like the question, because they don't like the answer. You should be doing aerobic exercise for a minimum of 30 minutes a day. And that's any age. That's starting. Adults should be doing an hour and a half to 2 hours. But that includes pushing your own wheelchair, trying your own transfers. It's very, very hard when you're weak to do aerobic exercise for that length of time, because when you're up on your feet, you can walk, you can push a hoover, you can do things that will count as exercise. So it is difficult. Nobody's saying that you should be doing an hour and a half to 2 hours. If you're non-ambulant, 30 minutes. But some people don't even like that, and they certainly don't like the word daily. It's a bit of a swear word. What is disuse atrophy? Disuse atrophy is what happens to any muscle, healthy or diseased or without a nerve supply or reduced nerve supply. It will happen to any muscle that's not exercised. And atrophy, as we know, means it shrinks. And disuse atrophy, and don't start getting snidey and sarky. We know what some of you are thinking. Yes, things that don't get used shrink. It's not only your muscles, it can be your skin, it can be other parts of your body, but it's not dead. It's not completely gone. There are muscles that are so weak that they take an enormous amount of switching back on. But a lot of these drugs will work on your disuse atrophy. The muscle is there. It needs working. We all have it, all of us. And you know that because if you are a parent or a carer or a spouse or a partner or whoever, and you go to the gym or you go out running and something aches, something hurts, you pull a muscle, it's because it hasn't worked for a long time. Disuse atrophy is one of the biggest problems we have in type 3 and the biggest problem we have in non-ambulant 3s. And why is that? That is because the muscles in your legs, or some of the muscles in your legs, are not strong enough to carry your body to make or allow you to walk. So your muscles are not strong enough for you to walk. Okay, fine. So you're sitting in a wheelchair. Okay, fine. But there are muscles that are working. There are core muscles, there are trunk muscles, there are arm muscles that because you are sitting down, not walking, are not getting used. Every time a child says to me, "Mummy, lift me up, Mummy, roll me over," if I think they can do it, I will not let the parent do it, because you are increasing their disuse atrophy and taking away an opportunity to exercise. Every time you wait for your carer to do something you probably could do if you only tried, you are increasing your disuse atrophy and taking away an opportunity to exercise. If you can't do it, doesn't matter, at least you've tried. And trying static muscle work, work with no movement, is still work. We have said this so often. Somebody must remember it. Contractures don't get better by themselves. You need to think that you cannot gain range. If you can't gain range, then try and avoid that and do things a different way. You can try stretching. Nice stretching is actually a really pleasant thing to do. As long as you are not hurting or being hurt, then stretching your shoulders, stretching your arms, getting those arms right above your head, stretching those shoulder blades, getting the muscles right. Remember, your shoulder blades are hung onto your body with muscles. They need a good stretch. You need a good stretch down. You need a good neck stretch. You need your arms stretched. A good stretch is a really effective thing to do, and good stretching can help muscles work. Surgery as an adult for contractures, you really need to be 100% sure of your goals, because it's not just your muscles that are contracted. Everything's got shorter. Your joint capsules, even the nerves have got shorter. Your skin is sort of fixed. You've still got to stretch the skin. Do not think about surgery lightly. Now, I remember one young man asking me about surgery for his hips, and he had a very valid reason for doing it. But if you've got tight hips and tight knees, just releasing your hips will not last, because your knees are still stuck up in the air. So before you have surgery, any surgeon will say yes. Make sure you have talked with a very experienced physio, be it adult or peds, but particularly for you adults, as to take on surgery, as to whether it will last, will it be effective, will the muscle still work afterwards? And is my muscle imbalance enough? If I'm going to cut the stronger muscles, are the weak muscles strong enough to do anything? A lot of thought needs to go into surgery in adults. What causes loss of ambulation? There are so many things, so many factors that make type 3s lose ambulation in the first one. And to be honest, the biggest one is increasing height and weight. And when I say weight, I don't mean getting fat. We used to say that for every inch you grew taller, you put on half a stone of bone, muscle, and everything else that went with it. You can't just keep growing and not put on weight unless you get skinnier and skinnier to the point where you're skeletal. So by increasing your bone length, you are putting weight. Muscle weighs a lot. If your bones and your muscles are longer, your tendons have to be longer, your number of the length of your blood vessels, the length of your nerves, everything's getting bigger. Don't forget that everything is bigger. Even your brains are getting bigger. Everything is heavier. Your head then becomes harder to hold. Increasing weakness is a problem. Increasing contractures is a problem. Scoliosis is a problem. Fractures are a big problem in type 3, and several people I know have stopped walking following fractures. Fear of falling is a big issue, or fear of not being able to get up is a big issue. Decreased motivation. If it's too hard, if it's not functional, it's not worth it, then you're not going to do it. If it's painful, you're not going to do it. A lot of our type 3s go into CAFOs. We've often talked about the difference between SMA style and the more common Duchenne style. And this is what many, many orthotic companies don't understand, is the difference between the normal CAFO that you will see and an SMA style CAFO. Although we are always ready to be flexible, that is generally, there's quite a big difference. But virtually all our younger type 3s, if they are under 12, 13 years old, they will go into CAFOs to try and keep them mobile, try and keep their spine mobile, try and keep them walking. And we have some very, very motivated young men and women in CAFOs who are doing extremely well. We use gaiters for children, particularly who are struggling to walk, be it to stand, be it for asymmetry. So we use gaiters. We can use one, we can use two. And adults, if you don't have contractures at the knees, hips, and ankles, if you're fairly contracture free but haven't stood for a long time, Gaiters could be an option for you as well. You just need to find a physio who knows what they're doing. Can therapy help to improve posture? We can help posture. We cannot stop scoliosis. So anybody who tells you that this method or that method will stop scoliosis in SMA is having you on or taking your money, because this is not idiopathic scoliosis. Idiopathic scoliosis is when you get scoliosis. Idiopathic means we don't know the reason, not that there's no reason. It's very, very common cause of scoliosis, but the muscles are normal. In SMA, they are not. So you can exercise, you can stretch, you can try your very best to keep going, but we can help improve posture. We cannot prevent scoliosis. Pilates, exercise, possibly yoga, sitting well at school, sitting well at home, getting off your iPads, or at least sitting in a decent position, making sure that your computers and laptops are at the right height, all help posture. So many things can improve your posture. And one of the big things that parents are picking up on is that we are asking children to use a keyboard more and more, that they don't spend long periods writing, because you always write in a screwy shape, asymmetrical posture, whereas a keyboard is much more symmetrical. So for long pieces of work, for the essay subjects, the histories, the philosophies, the psychologies, the sociologies, the English, we ask for keyboards for young people because it's much more symmetrical, less fatiguing, much better for your posture. Pain, we know that muscle pain as such is not a problem in SMA, but you can have pain from overstretching, you can have pain from quite marked fatigue. Obviously, back pain, you can get a lot of the very lordotic children who are standing will complain of back pain because their hips are tight. It's rare to get pressure sores. Pressure sores usually only come from orthotics or wheelchairs, but fractures and microfractures can be a problem. Microfractures aren't normally a problem in type 3. Microfractures are very much more the sort of children with quite severe bone density issues, but certainly fractures can be a problem in type 3. And sprains, are lots and lots and lots and lots of sprained ankles. And for that, we tend to use tri-lock splints a lot. If you want more information on that, give me a shout. Okay, taping, we can tape adults, we can tape children. It doesn't cure anything, but it is a very effective treatment for control, for learning control, and for helping to improve the line of movement, for getting those muscles working in the right direction. So we can use taping to help you. It's not a cure, but it's definitely effective used correctly. So to finish, because I'm sure there's more than a few questions, physio is boring. Please don't think physio. Think of functional exercise. Think this is doing you good. Think this is useful. Think, I want to do this. It's got to be fun. It's got to be effective. It's got to be fun for everyone. It's got to be positive. If it's not positive, you're not going to do it. It needs to be part of everyday life. If you can slot it into the morning routine, if you can slot it into cleaning your teeth or standing to do a particular activity or stretching at a particular time, then again, once it becomes part of routine, it's much easier to get it in there. Contractures, as we've said a million times, and I will never stop saying it, don't get better by themselves. If they've been there for more than 2 years, you are not going to have a lot of luck at stretching them out, because one contracture, a knee, is always going to have a contracture at the hip end, a contracture at the foot end, and everything just leads to one another. And unless surgery is an option, you're not going to really get very much from stretches. But you can splint to help at least maintain range. And I think that's about it. So Marnie,
hello.
Question time.
Yeah, we've got quite a few questions.
Go on, tell me there aren't any.
No, we've got quite a few. So
I had a funny feeling you might say that.
The first one is a really interesting question, to be fair, is with the introduction of treatments, how valid is the scale of typing for people? Soon with treatments, typing seems less relevant. in contrast to the possibility of a modern, individualized clinical tracking and scaling of life functions?
I agree that with treatment, you will change what an infant and child does. But if you are an adult with type 3, you are still an adult with type 3. If you are an adult or a teenager with type 2, irrespective of treatments, you are still an adult or a teenager with 2. It also helps us to understand where you are starting from. So while we know that the children who are treated from teeny weeny have 2 or 3 copies, they would have been a type 2 or a type 1 or a weak type 2. But it helps us to understand where a child is starting from and what we can expect. If you are a child who's getting Zolgensma and you have 1 copy, then the likelihood is, yes, you will do well, but you may not do as well as if you started even pre-symptomatic with 3 copies. But certainly with things like risdiplam and nusinersen, where you start is definitely about where you end up, because these are not cures. Again and again and again, every one of the companies will tell you these are not cures, these are treatments. What we're trying to do is make the type 1s into 2s, taking a Zolgensma out of the thing, because Zolgensma is certainly in a lot of countries is only being given to young children and can only be given once. So that if we take Zolgensma out of the equation, type 2, risdiplam and nusinersen, if we know where you start, we have a better idea of directing you, because we have a better idea of where you're going to end up. It's no good taking a type 1 who's got 2 or 3 copy numbers and making goals of walking. Yes, we have some type 1s who are walking. But the question is, are they going to walk in the same way a type 3 walks, or a good type 3 walks? No, they probably aren't. They're in orthoses, or they're walking short distances, or they can maybe do a few steps in the house. But we're not talking about what the Americans call a community ambulator, i.e. somebody who walks virtually everywhere. So yes, there is still a call for knowing where we're starting, so that we have a vague idea of where we can realistically plan to end up.
Okay. Next question is, hi Marion, my daughter has SMA type 3 and had corrective spinal surgery in 2014 and is currently on Evrysdi, and her strength is quite good, but she is still stiff around her shoulders and wants to know what exercises she can do to lessen the stiffness and hopefully gain more strength and range. She also wants to know what hip exercises she can do to get more range.
If this is a UK family, ping me, because I need more information, and that's not fair on everybody else who wants their questions answered. But I need to know what sort of range she's got. I need to know what she can do. I need to know what her hip flexion contractures are like. But certainly for shoulders, there's tons of stretches and nice stretches we can do. So ping me either through TreatSMA or find me, and we will see what we can do for you.
Okay, I'm just commenting that as a reply to their comment as well, so they can see that. So give me 2 seconds.
And I'm only saying a UK family because I don't always know what facilities people have got in other countries. I mean, you're very welcome to contact me from other countries, and I know people have, and hopefully my Greek families, I am coming out in September, if you can go green instead of being amber in Athens, please. But I don't know in every country what facilities you have, so you're going to have to give me more information if you're not pinging me from the UK.
Okay. Do physios need to be specialists in this type of illness? We seem to have problems to find a physio who knows about my granddaughter, 4 years old, type 1.
Not every community physio is a specialist in neuromuscular. If you're in the UK, your granddaughter should be under a neuromuscular service. And that is a definite, and that's back to standards of care. Your granddaughter in the UK should be being seen by a specialist neuromuscular service who will have a physio. Every pediatric service in the country, including Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, every specialist neuromuscular service should have a physiotherapist. I know of 2 that don't, but they're exceptions and there's always alternatives. So those neuromuscular physiotherapists should be advising the community physiotherapists. When you work in the community, you may have one type 1 SMA on your caseload, you may have two, but you may have 300 cerebral palsies and osteogenesis and cystic fibrosis and 1,000,001 different weird and wonderful syndromes. So unfortunately, one type 1 SMA is never going to make you an expert. So you can't blame that local physio for not having tons of experience. What you can say is she should be in touch with your local neuromuscular service, and your local neuromuscular physio should be in touch with her. And they should be working together for your granddaughter.
Okay, great. Next question is, hi, does Voiter therapy somehow help in correcting scoliosis and lordosis?
We have said this before. Voiter is an East European idea built for cerebral palsy. I'm not even convinced it does anything for cerebral palsy. It works on primitive movements. We don't like it in the UK. If you really, really, really want Voiter and you're obviously East European, you'll have to find yourself an East European physio, because there is not one UK trained physio in this country that I know who even thinks Voiter should be talked about. Sorry, it's not for SMA. Any intensive physio is going to work, but Voiter, every child who's ever come into our department screaming their heart out from Eastern Europe will say straight away, have they been getting Voiter? And the parents will be saying, yes, and they don't like physio. Well, we know they don't if you're asked to creep on your stomach when you can't lift your head up. It's a crazy therapy for SMA.
Okay. Are there better, less invasive techniques to correct scoliosis available?
Surgery, no, basically. If you want to stick on Lycra, fine, you won't stop the scoliosis. If you want to put a jacket on, you will slow down the rate of progress. The only thing apart from rods that is going to stop a scoliosis is stopping growing. But by the time you've stopped growing, your back may be a very horrible shape. And it's not only about your spine. Don't forget, if you have a severe curve in your thoracic spine to one side, and we've talked about this just last time or the time before, if you have a severe curve, it impacts on that lung as well. So you will have one quite small lung that's very prone to infections. It will impact on your sitting ability. It will impact on your hips and your pelvis. So trying to keep that spine straight is really, really, really important. And no, unfortunately, if there was alternative to rods, I am sure somebody would have found it by now. Nobody's saying in 20 years' time, somebody won't come up with something magical that can zip the spine up straight. But right now, I am not aware of anything apart from rods that will keep it straight, because gravity and SMA do not like each other. And it is really difficult to keep that spine up with asymmetrical muscle power.
Okay. Transfer boards, what are the best ones? I want to get back to transferring independently.
Okay, well, banana boards are pretty much the same. One of the things that people are using more and more are they turning things, the things that you put your feet on and that you can swivel with your feet as well as with your bottom. Because one of the things that people find is that when they're on a banana board, they can slide their bottom a bit, but they leave their feet behind. So sometimes you have this board that you can put your feet on that rotates as well, that helps you to swivel as well as slide. But really, banana boards are an OT thing. I've only ever seen a banana board that looks like a banana board. And well, that's not strictly true. You get the banana boards which are curved, and they're actually yellow as well, and they curve. And then you can have straight ones that go straight. The biggest problem with banana boards or transfer boards is the different heights and the wheels on the wheelchair. So really, it depends. With the little children, we just get them to fall forwards onto the bed and crawl from there. But then you've got to have the power to do that. But if you want to start transferring again, and we do, I know a couple of adults who are trying to transfer again, you need reasonable arm power, but you also need somebody who's going to come in and look where you're trying to transfer from wheelchair to bed or bed to wheelchair. You need somebody to look at the two different surfaces. It's actually I can't give you advice without knowing where you're trying to get from and to. So you need an OT to come into your home and help you.
I was just about to ask, is that something that an OT would help
It
with?
should be, but finding an OT is a bit like finding a nugget of gold in the local river.
Okay. Is there any standing equipment for adults?
Tons, loads and loads and loads and loads. There are standing frames, there are standing slings, there are tilt tables for adults. It really depends what you want. And of course, there are standing wheelchairs, which are ridiculously expensive. The best source of information in the UK, and because it's by email, you will find it from outside the UK as well, is Living Made Easy, which used to be the Disabled Living Foundation. Living Made Easy will, if you ping them an email, they will send you lots and lots of unbiased information about ways of regaining standing, standing slings, standing transfers, standing equipment. The other thing that is of interest is NAIDEX, which is the National AIDS for the Disabled exhibition, which is a horrible term, but they still call it NAIDEX, is back in the NEC in September. And they have loads of aids and different equipment. So it might be worth checking them out to see if it's worth a trip to the NEC to have a look and see if there's any standing equipment there. Now, a lot of the stuff at the NEC these days for NAIDEX is household stuff, beds and turning stuff, showers, accessible stuff, lifts and all that sort of thing. So if you specifically are looking for standing frames, I would check out the companies that are showing before you trot all the way to Birmingham and find that nothing is relevant to you. But as I say, Living Made Easy, and that's the name of the charity now, and that is where you will find them, should give you plenty of advice on standing equipment. Obviously, physios and OTs should also know it, but if you aren't seeing one, you may not be able to access that information.
Okay. My legs are now too tight, even though I feel I have the strength. My knees have bent. I'm gutted the contractors are stopping me from possibly walking. What can I do?
Well, as I say, you have to consider very, very carefully whether you think surgery will help. But my honest feeling is start with a standing sling. If you use a hoist, see if you can start with a standing sling, getting weight through your feet, at least trying to do some weight bearing. Because until you do that, you will have no real concept of how far you can go. So I would really try to get hold of a standing sling, because standing frame is not going to work if you are very contracted. Gaiters and CAFOs aren't going to work if you're very contracted. But if you really want to stand, and I know quite a few people who have quite severe contractures who have started in a standing sling, at least getting weight bearing, at least seeing where their muscles will take them, even doing some stepping. We have a brother and sister who are doing football in their standing slings, and get some exercise on your feet and see how that goes as a starter.
Do you suggest for people who perhaps haven't weighted for a long time and potentially have some form of ankle support or something to help them take the weights?
You may need ankle support. You may need built up AFOs. You could put a pair of new look shoes on, Marnie, you know about those. Boys might not find that a positive idea, but yes, you could have some sort of built up something, a boot or something that will get some weight under your feet. But ultimately, as any lady will tell you, you can stand on your toes and walk quite well. It's not the end of the world. We have toe walkers who walk their whole lives on their toes. So that isn't the biggest problem. The biggest problem that you need to be aware of when you are standing with not having stood for some time, and the beauty of a standing sling is that it can help, is osteoporosis, is whether you are going to have the bones to actually take the weight. And that is the beauty of a standing sling, because you can put as much weight as you feel comfortable with through your feet. But as I say, don't dangle, because you certainly won't be effectively using your muscles, and you can actually make things worse if you're just dangling in them. You need to be weight bearing.
And if someone's just asked if your legs are asymmetric.
Asymmetrical, yeah.
Yeah. Like one knee is tighter than the other. Is it worth having like a block to put under
Yes,
one foot?
yes, yes, because otherwise one will be off the floor. Absolutely. Stick something on the bottom of a shoe. Literally stick something on the bottom of a shoe. You can get some neoprene, or cut something out of neoprene or something, or get an OT or a physio or granddad or somebody to stick something so that you are weight bearing through both feet, both knees, both hips.
Okay, and someone just said, where do you get a standing sling?
That's a problem if you don't have a hoist. I do admit it is a problem if you don't have a hoist. You can get standing slings for portable hoists, but if you don't have a hoist, you're in trouble. And in fact, you can't have a standing sling if you don't have a hoist at all. So if you've got no hoist, and
I think they meant more like, do you get them through Physio or something like that?
Be able to get hold of a standing sling for you. There are companies. I have seen lots of suggestions. I know I have been in touch with Silverly 100 times and they haven't contacted me. But some people say Silverly are great. I used to think Silverly were the best company ever, but the 3 or 4 times that I have tried to get hold of them, I haven't heard from them. So I am not best pleased with Silverly at the moment, but if anybody does think Silverly are good, I have certainly seen other companies mentioned on the group on TreatSMA, but again, this is an OT thing or an ADEX thing or a Living Made Easy thing. Find out about your standing slings. I'm not sure. I have to be honest and say I have no idea how much they would cost if you wanted to buy them privately. I'm sure there's plenty of people out there do have that information.
Okay. What exercises can I do that will help me lift my bum off my chair?
Well, the first thing is get some shoulders, because you're never going to lift your bum without some shoulder work. And it was funny because I was thinking about this, what you need is blocks. And we used to use these a lot in spinal injuries. And that is either yoga blocks or bricks or something that are relatively high. You want a block that's about this high. You put your hands on and you start by using your shoulders and your arms to push down to lift your bottom. And from there, you can work your bottom. Now, the other exercise that's a really nice one for learning to lift your bottom is bottom walking. So when you are sitting on a bed or a plinth or even on the floor, if you do it, is shuffling back on your bottom and shuffling forwards on your bottom. And that's sort of like bottom walking. It's not swiveling, it's not going around in a circle, it's actually walking backwards and forwards, and that is excellent. And the other one, as I say, is blocks. So you can get a couple of yoga blocks or Pilates blocks. They're only a couple of quid in Tiger or Decathlon, or you can just get 2 bricks or something similar to bricks. Tissue boxes won't work, they're too squashy. And what you need is a lot of work on pushing down on your hands. Have the blocks literally beside your hips, or you can use the arms of your wheelchair if you have arms on your wheelchair, and try lifting that way. And that's the way you start. The other thing is, if you can use a therapy ball, and that's a big if, because most adults will not use a therapy ball because it's just too dangerous to get you on, too dangerous to get you off. But if you are more able and can use a therapy ball, that's a lovely way of starting to bounce up using a therapy ball.
Okay. Is it...
Again, if you've got a sling and you can sling onto a therapy ball, you can work in your sling on a therapy ball.
Okay. Is it realistic to regain ambulation after losing it?
Now the question is, how long have you lost it? That is the sensible question. It's no good saying, is it realistic to regain if you haven't been walking for 20 years, or you never really walked that far. If you're one of the 30, 40 steps maximum kids, and it's 20 years ago, then no, I don't think it is realistic. If you lost ambulation a year, 18 months ago, and you were quite a good walker, yes, I do believe it is possible. And I do have one young lady who has just become eligible for nursing, who lost walking a little while ago, but she has stayed walking in CAFOs, and that's the important thing. we do think we may be able to get her back on her feet because she stayed walking in CAFOs.
Okay. Can CAFOs be made for adults?
Yes. But you will have a lot of difficulty finding a company who will do it. There's probably only 2 companies in the country that will make CAFOs for adults with SMA. There are companies, because there are companies who do them for spinal injuries places. So if you live near a spinal injuries unit, it may well be that there is an orthotic company who will make them. But what they make for spinal injuries are much, much heavier than the ones they make for SMA. But there's probably only 2 companies that I know of, Peacocks in Newcastle and John Florence, who will make CAFOs for adults. John Florence definitely do. Certainly they have continued to make CAFOs for adults who they have treated as children. They don't often take on an adult patient, but they will continue to make for people who they've made them for as children. It's not impossible. Don't quote me, because John Florence may well do. And Peacocks in Newcastle, I'm sure, will make CAFOs for adults. But as I say, if you have a local spinal injury service, and there aren't lots of them dotted around the country, then those orthotic services may well make CAFOs for adult SMAs. But I don't know many services that would have the experience.
Is it safe to start standing if your hips have started to dislocate slightly?
As long as it's not painful, it's certainly perfectly safe. There are plenty of our type 1s and type 2s who are standing on dislocated hips without any pain and any problem. And in the day, as I am old, and in anybody, grandma's day, if there's plenty of grandmas and grandpas out there, in our day, as they say, kids used to walk around on dislocated hips. It wasn't unusual. We didn't have hip ultrasound in our day. You know, if you were born breech and you had dislocated hips, you had dislocated hips and you walked on them until somebody said, oh, he's got a funny gait, and did something about it. But even then, it wasn't normal to treat dislocated hips until you got to an adult, when they perfected false hip joints, and then they'd take your hips out and start again. But, you know, people walk for years and generations and hundreds of years on dislocated hips. I'm sure in the sort of 15th, 16th, 17th century, kids walked around on dislocated hips, probably sat on horses fairly easily on dislocated hips as well. So yes, I mean, obviously you can live on dislocated hips. I'm sure people didn't die of dislocated hips in the Middle Ages.
Okay. Are there any posture correction systems that could be used with me having spinal surgery and now tilting bad from the pelvis?
You really need to be assessed by a spinal surgeon. I mean, I can't answer that without having a good look at whoever you are. And obviously, if you're not a child, I can't really have a look and tell you very much anyway. But I can't tell you that in a webinar like this, because without seeing what's going on, I have no concept of what you're trying to achieve and what the difficulties are. But if you're really thinking that you need a review, you need to either go back to your spinal surgeon, depending if he's still under that service, or go back to a neuromuscular service and see if they have an adult spinal surgeon or an adult orthopedic surgeon who can have a look at you.
Okay. I have contractures in my elbows, which is affecting my range of movement. Is there anything I can do to correct these, as I've had them for a long time?
There's a very strange thing about elbow contractures. If it's just elbow up and down, then yes, you can stretch them, you can splint them, you can try and get a little bit of range. But very importantly, you need to improve the movement at your shoulders, because people forget, even if you've got a tight elbow, if you haven't got the movement at your shoulder, you will lose reach. And we talked a lot about the difference between reach and lean. And there's a big difference between reach and lean. And if you can move from your shoulder, which is very, very rarely contracted, that will increase your range dramatically. So power at the shoulder, but you can stretch an elbow if you can turn your hand over and over. Now, if you have lost the ability to turn your hand palm up and you are tight at the elbow, no, you can't stretch your elbow. It's very, very strange. If it's just tight up and down, but you can turn your hand palm up, you can stretch your elbow because it's just the tendons across your elbow. If you've lost the ability to turn your hand palm up, then no, because that is a much different thing. That is movement that you've lost and contracted, not just the muscle. So it will depend on whether you can still turn your hand over.
Okay. Is boxing a good exercise for SMA?
Yes, we love boxing. We love boxing. It's symmetrical, it's fun. Be careful who you box or what you box, but yes, we really, really love boxing.
Okay. I see a lot of people using hand cycles. However, I tried one, and what was preventing me using it was my stability with my elbows off my armrests. Is there anything I can do to help improve that, my core, before trying to exercise
shoulders? You need more shoulders as well as more core. If you can't keep your arms up, it's from here that you're having the difficulty. You've got to get those shoulders working.
Okay. Let's see another question. Sorry, 1 second, Marion. No, it's Marion's dog. Is there anything that can be done for ankle contractures when they are really painful to stretch?
Well, firstly, stop stretching them if they're really painful. There's 3 things that can be done. You can splint them and rest them and then try and actively move them and gently, gently, gently stretch them. You can serially cast them depending on whether there's any give at all, or you can do surgery, but it really depends on how important it is to change the position of your ankles as to whether you would bother going with surgery. But splint them and rest them in a good position, and that's a really good place to start. But you shouldn't be stretching them if they're painful, no, because you set up a pain reaction, and the pain reaction does the exact opposite from what you want. So if your feet are in pain, you'll push your foot down, and that's not what you're trying to achieve. You're trying to achieve foot up. And if by putting your foot in pain, you're just pushing it down, well, then you're counterproductive. So ultimately, splint them, rest them in a good position, and try and work from there. But they should never hurt, because if you cause pain when you're doing stretches, you will end up getting the opposite movement, which you don't want.
My daughter's ankles are different. One is tighter than the other. Could this possibly lead to issues with posture over time if she's walking on one foot more than the other?
Yes, undoubtedly. But it's a bit chicken and egg. What came first, the poor posture or the poor foot, the asymmetrical feet? But definitely, if you're walking asymmetrically, then it will lead to problems higher up. And if your daughter was under our service and we had an asymmetrical walker, we would serially cast them.
Okay. Are exercise benches or therapy benches worth investing in if you can't use a therapy ball?
Quite a lot of people have been using them with children. They don't go up very high for adults. I haven't seen an adult therapy bench. They maybe have them, but if it really depends what you do. Be careful with the very rounded ones, but yes, you could probably do quite a lot of exercise on a therapy bench that would get you out of the wheelchair, wouldn't put you on the floor, and would keep you off a bed. So there's probably quite a lot you can do on a therapy bench. I've never used them with adults, but then it's a long time since I've worked with adults. We certainly use them quite a lot with children. You can kneel at them, you can push on them, you can stand from them, that you can straddle sit them. So yes, there is quite a lot you can do. As I say, I haven't used them with adults, but I can't see why you wouldn't.
Okay. If you've lost quite a lot of strength in your legs, but you've still got quite a lot of upper body strength, would crutches be helpful with SMA to be able to continue walking?
Strange you should say that. For an ambulant 3, I was abroad at the very beginning of last year before lockdown, and we had a young lady came to the clinic who had been given a wheelchair, and she was very, very unhappy. in a lot of pain, so she said, sitting in the wheelchair, and she showed us her walking, and it was horrible. And I actually said to the physio in the country where I was walking, can you get her a pair of crutches? And we put this young lady, I mean, she was about 11 or 12, onto crutches, and off she went. She said, oh, I like these much better than the wheelchair, and she disappeared off and didn't want to give them back because they actually hadn't been given to her. But yes, for definite, I would be very, very selective in who I gave to crutches, because there are people who will just lean onto them, get an awful posture, an awful asymmetry, and won't be the right thing. So it's not an answer for everybody. It seriously is not. Some people, crutches will work. Some people you would need to go into CAFOs. So it really needs assessing. It's difficult for me to say yes to everybody, because I wouldn't say yes unless I'd assess them, but it's certainly a possibility. But if it really makes a horrible posture, an asymmetrical posture, and actually just means that you're hanging with all your weight through your arms, no, then I'd go to CAFOs.
Okay. Are parallel bars that you see a lot in rehab centres helpful? People
well, yes, but I mean, they don't go anywhere. They only go up and down. It's a bit like swimming lengths in a swimming pool. Yes, they're helpful, but they're a little bit boring and uninspiring. So you'd have to find a way of making them fun, to be honest. We hardly use them at all. We hardly use them at all. We use them for rehab. We used it for one young lady recently when we had her in for intensive rehab, a type 3, who had lost the ability to walk, and we got her back on her feet. And we used the bars, and we mainly used them so that she could use one arm securely, one arm rather than both bars. And we'll use them for periods of rehab, but in the long term, I do know in America, it's very common for families to get a set of parallel bars to walk in, but I find them a little uninspiring, and just, unless you can make them fun, which I'm sure you can, we don't necessarily recommend them. But if it keeps a child walking, then great, yes, do. If it keeps an adult walking, even better.
Okay, I think that may be it for our questions.
Okay, so what we were talking about, Marnie, was running out of topics. Unless people are going to suggest things to talk about, I personally am happy to talk about whatever people want to talk about, but I feel that we're just about exhausted all the topics that I can think of. People are going to have to say what they want to hear. Otherwise, we may well cut down to every 3 weeks, because I think we've almost covered everything. I know people have asked about having taping again. So if people want to hear taping again, they're going to have to let us know. But people are going to have to tell us what they want, because we're definitely finding it more difficult to come up with ideas. Obviously, what would be nice is to hear other professionals rather than just always hearing me, like a dietitian or a speech therapist. People have to let us know what they want. I appreciate there was a lot of questions tonight, and we've gone on a long time, which is quite positive, because it means there's lots out there that people want to hear. But you're going to have to let us know, Lucy and Marnie and I. Marnie's feeling far too sexy to be sensibly on camera today, so she's looking amazing, and she didn't want to show everybody. But generally, the three of us do need to have your suggestions about what you want to hear. So let us know, otherwise we'll cut down a bit, because we've probably covered most things up to now.
Yeah, what I might do is on the TreatSMA groups, I'm going to put polls up.
Yeah.
To have people make suggestions.
Yeah. I do think people wanted to hear a bit more about taping, but apart from that, I think we've probably covered about most things.
Yeah. Okay. Well.
All right. Okay. Night, everybody.
Thank you.
Time to take the dog for a walk.
Enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.